I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The week before Labor Day, Hurricane Ida came through Washington, D.C., dumping rain and causing flash flooding in Montgomery County that killed 19-year-old Melkin Cedillo in the low-lying parts of Rockville near my home. Many more died in New York and New Jersey. In this episode, I talk with Eliza Cava, Director of Conservation at Audubon Naturalist Society, about the complexities of stormwater management that should have prevented the flooding, and how to balance the real demand for more housing with environmental concerns.
How much you got my heart racing. I haven't felt this in a long time. Do you know how much you got my...
If you are new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities.
I had figured you out. You find a way to
Music for this episode comes from Sic Em Buster, a Washington area rock and metal band. The excerpts for this episode come from their song I've Got Athlete's Foot and I'm Wearing Your Socks. You can find them on Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube.
I'm just so tired of trying to make sense of everything that you...
In the news this week, about 1,000 students were quarantined in Montgomery County Public Schools a week after school reopened this fall. And there is now parent anger over quarantining of students. This is a fast-evolving situation. MCPS has been issuing new and updated rules, but at the bottom, this is a failure of planning and leadership. After 18 months of the pandemic, MCPS has had a hard time coming up with basic solutions to problems: where and how to hold classes, what staffing looks like, what testing should look like, what happens when unvaccinated elementary school students take off their masks to eat lunch in a crowded cafeteria. The Delta surge among the unvaccinated in Montgomery County is significantly about school children. Though hospitalizations and casualty rates remain stable, the trajectory looks ominous. On September 6th, MCPS issued community letters in 4 schools announcing positive cases. On September 7th, letters went out in 8 schools. And September 8th, these letters went out in 22 schools. The testing regimen has been particularly called out by parents. MCPS has not been testing secondary school students, most of whom are vaccinated. As of September 9th, testing remains opt-in. That is, a family would have to sign in to be tested, rather than opt-out, which would mean a more robust testing strategy. There is some back and forth between the state of Maryland, Montgomery County government, and public schools over testing kits. The state says that the county and the public schools should have enough test kits, but MCPS has publicly asked County Executive Mark Elrich for more tests for students. DHHS, the County Department of Health and Human Services, which is the coordinating agency for testing and contact tracing, seemed to be in some amount of disarray. Apart from testing, there seems to be a continuing shortage of contact tracers. From a peak of about 60 contact tracers over the winter of 2020 and 2021, DHHS has let half go over the spring. In early summer, this number was down to 20 and now back around 30. In the middle of all this, the chief health officer of the county quit, and there is now an ongoing search to find a replacement. Back to MCPS. Complaints about most schools planning indoor lunch led to many schools offering outdoor options on a rotating basis. The school district and school principals really have perverse incentives. Consider this. If a student were to be infected with the COVID-19 virus, the school principal or the school district would not be held responsible or liable in any way. But in an effort to mitigate COVID-19 transmission, if a school held outdoor lunch or even outdoor learning and a kid walked off school property, the principal and the district would be held liable. Public pressure on the issue forced many schools to offer outdoor lunch options, but it has been like pulling teeth. Interesting story in the data from MCPS Virtual Academy. Enrollment numbers show that minority groups in the county, consistent with what we know nationwide, have been less likely to want to go back to in-person school. MCPS Virtual Academy has about 3,000 students, so about 2% of the student population, which is overall a low number. A week before school reopened, and based on unofficial numbers I was able to get, the 3,000 break down into 1,200 elementary school students and 1,800 secondary school students. The farm's number, free and reduced meals, is about 50%. The average across the school district is about 35%. 20% of the students in Virtual Academy are special education, while system-wide that percentage is 11%. Roughly 30% of the students are Latino and 25% each African American and Asian. 15% of the students in Virtual Academy are white. Please keep in mind that these are unofficial numbers. I have asked for official numbers and will update once I get them from MCPS. The story based on the unofficial numbers shows that poor families, special education families, ethnic and racial minority families have over-enrolled in Virtual Academy, raising the question whether they believe in-person school to be more unsafe. The overall numbers are low, and these are, I should point out again, unofficial numbers, so definitive conclusions will have to wait. In non-school and non-COVID news, Rockville and Shady Grove metro stations are scheduled to be closed for 3 months starting the week of September 12th. Apparently, just when people were beginning to return to commuting by metro, WMATA, Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, has decided to remain with an old refurbishment plan. To top it all, transit buses feeding Shady Grove and Rockville stations will not be rerouted to Twin Brook, the new end of the Red Line, for the next 3 months. There is also no effort to sequence the refurbishment work to reduce dislocation. Washington Metro does seem to have taken hard lessons to remain in good repair over its mission of transporting people. This week is the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. The United States is finally out of Afghanistan. The commemoration of the attacks is going to carry new weight following the tragedy of American withdrawal. In the Washington, D.C. region, with so many involved in the national security state, it is hard to avoid introspection about what happened, what could have been, and how much has been lost. As we work through this national tragedy, we also welcome refugees from Afghanistan who are going to become our new neighbors and friends. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. This week's interview features Eliza Cava of the Audubon Naturalist Society. But I should point out that to prepare for this episode, I also spent 2 non-recorded hours with Casey Anderson, chair of Montgomery County Planning Board, looking out from a glass-walled conference room in the board's spanking new headquarters in Wheaton. It was a breathtaking view that extended from the Washington Monument in the south to the Sugarloaf Mountain in the north, and Tyson's Corner to the west. The vast expanse of Montgomery County was covered with trees. Right at our feet, however, was Wheaton Mall, an expanse of concrete that surely is a nightmare for flooding. In Anderson's view, redeveloping old structures, such as Wheaton Mall, is the best defense the county has against flooding. Rather than stop development to help stormwater management, as many activists have argued, Anderson wants faster development to get rid of old buildings and public infrastructure that appear to have been built without much thought to flooding in the first place. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta, and I'll be back with Eliza Cava of Audubon Naturalist Society. Eliza Cava, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Let's start with what the extent of the stormwater problem is in Montgomery County.
Stormwater is the fastest growing contributor of pollution to the Chesapeake Bay. The fact that the Chesapeake Bay is so vital and so big has granted it some special. It's been especially regulated under the Clean Water Act, and it has what's called a total maximum daily load, or a TMDL. That's a fancy acronym that means basically pollution diet. There are pollution diets under the Clean Water Act for rivers and streams at all scales, and the Chesapeake Bay is one of the biggest in the country, because it is one of the largest, watersheds to have such a TMDL. And so that creates this cascade of regulations from the federal to the state to the local level. And all kinds of pollution have to be managed in order to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. And the goal for having all the elements in place to have the Chesapeake Bay cleaned up is for 2025. And we are not really on track, and the stormwater sector is the furthest behind. A lot of investments have been made in agriculture to reduce agricultural pollution, industrial pollution, wastewater treatment plant pollution, but stormwater has lagged behind. Montgomery County was one of the earliest jurisdictions in the area to tackle stormwater through creating a dedicated source of funding called the Water Quality Protection Charge. And I don't have it to hand the exact year that began, but it was long before the state required it. The county realized that stormwater management was an issue, both for water quality and for flooding reasons, and initiated a way to charge residents based on the equitable arrangement of how much impervious surface is on your property, how much pavement do you have, because that's fundamentally the contributor to the problem. Montgomery County has had a tremendous stormwater management program for a long time under several county executives, several directors of the Department of Environmental Protection. They've been working really hard to use the water quality protection charges as well as grants and loans. They do apply for and get grants and loans, which they can then direct to others. But they've started with what feels like the low-hanging fruit to them. So that's another way to look at it. Is they started with what can we do first and quickest, and cheapest. So for a period of time, that was ponds. Ponds have always been around. Not always, but you've needed stormwater management ponds for a long time to capture rain that would otherwise flood your new development. So many older developments, if they have any form of stormwater management, have a pond. And one of the things that the county storm DEP did was to begin working with homeowners associations and also their own publicly owned ponds or highway ponds, and begin to retrofit those to meet modern stormwater standards. And they did that for a number of years. And that felt to them like an efficient investment of funds, and they got a lot of bang for the buck out of it. Then they ran out of ponds, and they started to look for other opportunities. Any house built before the 1990s has typically no required stormwater management. And so when you trigger the need for a new permit, then these new laws kick in, and you have to start managing your stormwater on your property. An existing homeowner is pretty unlikely to do a lot to meet that. Some people do add huge additions, and then they have to go through it. But often what happens is this is in redevelopment. This is when somebody sells the house and a developer wants to rebuild it or make a big extension, make it saleable to the modern market. That's a reasonable time to ask a homeowner to do a major investment, is when there's a big transfer of capital already happening. I don't see any problem with that. I think when we're looking at what the agencies are doing, they're really struggling with site control and focusing on the properties that they do control that are large. And it's not the individual homeowners that are the sort of missing the medium hanging fruit that I think they could get to. It's the larger institutional properties, and commercial properties. Once you actually get to a really large size institutional property like the University of Shady Grove, they actually have their own small MS4 permit, small stormwater permit. But the medium-sized ones, the strip malls, the department store complexes, the larger apartment complexes, those are the places where there's real opportunities, and there's always going to be negotiation. The county will have to work with the landowners, and they'll have to, offer incentives, offer support, offer assistance. But that's where you could get a lot at once done. Whereas with the individual homeowners, it's really a lot to ask, I think, to ask individual homeowners to make really significant investments when they don't have the capital coming in. Now, do I wish everybody would just voluntarily do so? Yes. And the county has programs to help them do it. They have a Rainscapes program that offers some great support for anybody who wants to install a rain garden or a green roof or a cistern or a rain barrel.
Is that like a first come, first serve program that runs out every year?
It has started running out. We were talking with the county recently, and their operating theory is that people are spending so much more time at home. They want to do more gardening and landscaping. And so the applications have gone very high. The county was not prepared for how high the applications would go.
Do you think this is because these programs are not prioritized?
Stormwater management is important to the public this week. It was important a couple other weeks in the summer. People forget about floods and stormwater, even really big ones. The people who are recovering obviously are recovering for a long time. But the rest of us kind of go about our business, and it's really easy to forget. And I think that is probably one of the big reasons why it's kind of hard to sustain energy and interest and funding in stormwater management. Another is, and I've heard this actually from regulator friends, that they always feel like the bad guy. People own private property and they want to do what they want to do on their private property. And stormwater management sometimes has tension with other laws and requirements on property. So, for example, a lot coverage requirement on your R30 or your R60 lot might allow you to build to within X number of feet of the lot line and cover X number amount of it with impervious surface. But what stormwater management requires is that you treat the volume of the runoff from that impervious surface on your property. And once you have, depending on the soil in your property.
Can I get a clarification on that, please? It is my understanding that the law is about infiltration, not runoff.
It's about infiltrating a certain amount of the runoff. Correct.
If you are making a law only about what infiltrates and not what runs off, then then you can't measure performance by the runoff at all, because the runoff measure depends on the size of the storm, over which we individually don't have any control.
Oh, that's right. The runoff measure was identified to be something like it's probabilistic. It's based on a certain amount. How likely is it that we get this amount of rain? And there will be some storms like the ones from Hurricane Ida that you could never write a regulation to capture. But one of the arguments that we frequently make is, time to set those runoff limits higher.
In order to prepare for this episode, I spent 2 hours with Casey Anderson, chair of the Montgomery County Planning Board. And we spent that time in their new headquarters in Wheaton, looking down really at Westfield, Wheaton Mall, which is what he wanted to show me. And he said that, look down. And he said, the runoff from Westfield Wheaton is the problem. The fact that Westfield Wheaton was built before 1990, right, without stormwater management standards, is the problem. That in fact, if we allow redevelopment, right, faster and more redevelopment, we will get better stormwater management standards in the new structures, both public and private, that are built as a consequence. There's a lot of criticism of the planning board over the waivers and the Department of Permanent Services over the waivers that they get. And he pointed out that the waivers don't nullify the standards fully. They are a percentage waiver. For example, in Pike and Rose, he pointed out that the waiver is about 30%, right? And he's pointed out that 70% infiltration was better than zero infiltration that was happening before. So, in fact, the waivers facilitate movement forward, and somehow the perfect can be the enemy of the good is a problem. So, where are you on redevelopment? How do you see it? How do we balance those different goals? How do we move forward?
How we think about housing and how we think about the stormwater management around redevelopment. We are wearing our Audubon Naturalist Society hats. Stormwater Partners Network is a broader coalition that consists of many citizens and watershed and civic groups around the county, as well as other environmental groups, and has not taken any formal positions on sort of housing and redevelopment.
Sure, maybe we can start with clarifying the runoff requirements, please.
There's a range of requirements depending on the impervious coverage of the lot. Up to 2.6 inches sort of it can be the maximum requirement. It does come down, and it's over a 24-hour period, not per hour. Those runoff curves that tell you how many inches do you need to infiltrate are based on, again, the probabilities of storms of different sizes hitting our region. It's time to reevaluate those curves. They're very important. If we do allow, let's say, too many waivers, it's hard to know what the tipping point is. We don't have good outcome measures on how much rain is not captured. And how, what we know is when a giant flood comes along, but we don't know from which properties, was that really the worst part of the problem? And, we shouldn't have to. We should be able to do this with regulations that work for pretty much everyone.
Given that storms are intensifying, we should be preparing for a higher intensity of storms. So what is that higher intensity of storm?
I wear 3 different hats when I'm talking about stormwater. And so the Choose Clean Water Coalition last year said to the state of Maryland that the Maryland is updating their stormwater permits and their overall guidance for how counties can implement the permits, and had proposed that. So first of all, one more clarification on how many inches. If you are doing new development of a greenfield area, you have to meet up to the 2.7 inches of storm infiltration, okay, of a given storm in a 24-hour period. If you are redeveloping, so if you, Sunil, are redeveloping, meaning you're just adding to your existing house, you have to meet the 1-inch storm requirement. So it already recognizes that there is a difference, and as Casey might say, some is better than the perfect is not. You don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. That is already written into the law. New development is held to a stricter standard than redevelopment. So by the way, when you're waiving for redevelopment, that means you're waiving even that lower standard. Just, for what it's worth. So Maryland had proposed that they would give credit up to storing up to 3 inches of a storm, right? So it's either up to 1 inch or up to 2.7 inches, and they're going to give extra credit for up to 3 inches. And frankly, we think that's a great start, especially if it's, if that credit is given in all cases, redevelopment and new development. What we need to do is continue to look at the frequency of storms and test the frequency and the volume of storms. Is up to 3 inches the right number, or do we need to even go further with the credit that we're giving? But that's how it's done in the law as currently stated, is not that they're not ready to increase the flat requirements. Do we think they should? Sure. But what they want to start doing is giving bonus credit. And 3 inches seems like the right place to start.
In all the discussion about stormwater, we have not had a discussion about flooding. And flooding, as we saw recently, affects I would say, those of us that are most vulnerable. Those of us that buy and live in floodplains close to creeks and rivers. And that's exactly what killed this 19-year-old young man in Rockville. What is your thinking about the flooding issue? And, just protecting the Chesapeake is extraordinarily important. Climate change is something that we have to address. I'm totally on board, but I'm also thinking now of this young 19-year-old and his family.
Yeah. And how many more people in New York and New Jersey?
Correct.
many of whom lived in basement apartments because that's what they can afford. It's huge. It's tremendous. And the regulatory tools that we have in place are, largely oriented around what I was telling you about the Chesapeake Bay. The county certainly has the power to make investments around flooding. But my understanding is there's not a coordinated countywide strategy for that, the same way there is for stormwater management to meet the existing regulations. So, they will work on flood barriers and they will work on flood mitigation in specific places. But listen, if you move the water from one place, where is it going to go? If you move it because it's flooding somebody upstream, you put it back in the stream, that means that stream is going to flood higher downstream and whoever lives there. So this is a real social compact problem. You can't really fix it for just one person or one place. You've then, by definition, you've moved that water almost certainly to someplace where it's going to affect somebody else. And that's why catching that rain and infiltrating it as close as possible to where it fell is just tremendously critical. The sort of older model, and I described this earlier on, is you catch all the water that falls in your development and you put it in a pond. And so that's how you're going to handle flooding. You size your culverts enough so that the water can move smoothly to that pond. And then you use that pond as a storage facility and you let it trickle into the stream later on. That's fine up to a point. But if your storms are so big that they overwhelm the drainage capacity you put in place, they might overwhelm your pond. There is a technical solution that has a lot of opportunities for win-win, and that's flood wetlands. Wetlands used to be our natural flood protection.
Where do you want wetlands?
I don't have an answer to that question yet, Sunil. I wish I did.
You may know that County Executive Mark Elrich, in his weekly report last week, said that he wants floodplain protection along the lines that you're suggesting. Right? This raises the question of where you'd be allowed to develop and where you're not allowed to develop. Right? And that's a very important political question that we need to decide as a county. And I understand that you may not have specific locations worked out yet, but do you have in your mind certain prime opportunities?
The county is blessed with owning the stream corridors. Many, many, many of the stream corridors are owned by the county. So what can we do? Again, this is the same question the county has asked itself for a long time. What can we do with that low-hanging fruit of ownership of the land? And I'll give you one example that's very familiar to me because I drive past it, or I bike past it all the time on my bike commute. Right at where Rock Creek crosses the district line from Montgomery County into the district, it's Montgomery Park's property. There is a large floodplain there. We talked about Meadowside Stables is on one part of it. And then there are some soccer fields and Candy Cane Village Park. Candy Cane Village Park was the site of some scary flooding where a kid was stranded a couple of years ago and had to be rescued. So that's an example of that park is in the floodplain. And so there are some risks to that. But in general, using floodplain land as multiple purpose public lands, this sponge city idea that is gaining traction in Europe is one way to really think about it. And there may be some opportunities for the county to buy land to add specifically because it's in the floodplain without needing to increase the regulations. That could be one way to go.
It is one thing to say the county owns these lands, and another thing where I think maybe Parks and Planning owns the land, which is an independent agency from the county itself. And so there are significant coordination issues between working those two entities together. So I think there's a governmental coordination problem that needs to be resolved in order to do the kinds of things that you're talking about. The county itself, I don't think, has the ability to do it.
It is fundamentally a coordination question, and it's been a challenge for us. As you can tell, we have had to master, and we don't pretend to be, the masters of every single one of these items that we're talking about. They're very complex. We've studied them for years, and they're very complex and they're very hard to keep straight. And, so there's a level of sort of technical knowledge that the agencies have and bring, each within their own spheres, that I think probably makes it challenging to coordinate right there, because they're each sort of protecting their own laws and regulations. And then I think there are also some real tensions in what they want to get done and what their priorities are. But it's been a real challenge for us. We recognize here's an example. The Department of Transportation has X number of streets that they repave, recurb, even work on the drainage every year. And they have money from the Water Quality Protection Charge to do some of that work, especially around drainage. So that's where some of the flood control work comes in, is the Department of Transportation when they're regrading roads. Every single time they lift up a road, they do not necessarily install a new bioswale, which is one of the water treatment mechanisms. There's some coordination challenges going on there because the Department of Environmental Protection spends years identifying streets, working with the homeowners, trying to figure out exactly where the bioswales should go. Then they coordinate, then they get the Department of Transportation to do the project. But the Department of Transportation, meanwhile, is turning over roads all the time. And some of them, maybe even are in right-of-ways where they don't have so many homeowners who might be upset about it. And they're not installing bioswales kind of as a standard matter, of course. Brand new roads, yes. Brand new roads meet the new development standards. But when they're doing the repaving, it doesn't necessarily, I guess, it must be that it doesn't trigger the permit requirements all the time. And so they don't do it. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure why. I don't understand why. They should, every time they pave a road, every time they're out there with equipment, they should add a bioswale.
In that specific case, I would say the coordination lies in the county executive's office. Have you approached the county executive about this?
The Green Streets issue, we approached the last county Executive Leggett on. This is very public. It was written about in the Bethesda Beat. We had a big fight with the county executive Leggett on stormwater management, and specifically around some of these Green Streets projects. He felt that they were too expensive, and he was hearing pushback from residents that they didn't want to pay the increasing water quality protection charges required. And he proposed and was able to pass a really significant cut in proposed future spending on stormwater management in 2018. And that cut persists. And frankly, one thing we haven't talked about is that the requirements for stormwater management have been reduced by the state for the next 5-year permit term, even though we know that the problem keeps getting worse. So there's some real interactions between sort of the politics of what are people willing to pay and the state's requirements on where do they want to expend their priorities and efforts on enforcement and requirements that are, that to a certain extent leave our local agencies caught in the middle. They have a hard time figuring out, where they should prioritize because they get conflicting messages.
However, in Washington, D.C., the Department of Energy and Environment has done a remarkable job of pushing a lot of these things.
They have done a remarkable job. They, however, are doing almost all of their stormwater management work is in redevelopment, which is happening because of the economic growth and development of the city. So one thing that what DC is not doing as much of, which Montgomery County is doing more of, is making those public investments in the public surfaces and right-of-ways. They obviously are doing plenty of it, but DC Water is actually doing more than the Department of Energy and Environment. Those two agencies operate their own programs. And the Department of Energy and Environment, for their permit, is leaning a lot on the redevelopment regulations kicking in rather than direct investments.
I think what Planning Board Chair Casey Anderson would say is that's what he wants to do.
During my Audubon Naturalist Society hat, I agree with Casey Anderson. Redevelopment should absolutely bring older structures up to date on stormwater management, or at least closer to up to date on stormwater management. Full stop, no question. I know we've talked a lot about problems, and they're tricky political problems. I completely agree with you on that. They're not really, they are technical issues, and they require some technical, work in the solutions, but they mostly do require political solutions. But climate change is very real, and we keep getting warnings in so many different forms. And a lot of what we can do to help fight climate change will also help fight flooding and stormwater management issues. If we can build more compactly around transit-oriented development so that we need fewer cars, so that we need fewer pavements, so that we burn less fossil fuels in heating and cooling our homes, that will help with the overall climate change problem and eventually stabilize our storminess and bring less pavement overall and bring stormwater management up to scale and leave more room for trees and forests and therefore lower the heat island effect, which is so deadly. Also, the heat is actually kills far more people than floods do. So these are big problems that can be solved in so many different ways. But really, I think there's a vision for a solution. And the question is, how do we achieve that vision?
At the core of it is population growth, right? There's a long tradition in environmentalism that looks at population growth as a problem. And I'm talking about Garrett Hardin. I'm talking about the population bomb. And this, over time, we've moved away a little bit from the idea that population growth is the central problem that we can resolve. And in my mind, the individual choice of reproduction, which Garrett Hardin, as you know, wanted to enclose and provide only to certain individuals, we have protected that choice by doing other things, such as changing our built environment, such as changing how we our economic structure. Those things are viewed as being more tractable, more changeable, rather than attacking that fundamental individual choice about reproduction. Where are you on that?
I'm going to answer personally for me, Eliza Cava, a human being. I believe that people's choice in how they want to grow their families is indeed inviolable. And it should be, and I think there's plenty of data that says it can be fairly decoupled from a lot of our environmental problems. Not all of them, but climate change is a problem of resource consumption. And the per capita resources that we consume in this country have nothing to do with our total population numbers. It has to do with per capita. Many more people around the world live in larger families, live in denser communities, and use far fewer resources than we do in North America. And so I think that that argument, which is a historical one in the environmental movement, often ends up slipping into wanting to tell other people what to do. And we need to take responsibility for our own resource use and make a vision for ourselves of how we want to live that allows us to reduce our resource use while having and holding joyful communities where we save, ourselves, our sanity, our senses of connection with one another, and the nature that we live with and we rely on. We need to focus on ourselves rather than telling other people what they should and shouldn't do with their bodies and with their families. Because frankly, they're not the problem from climate change perspective. That's not the problem. The problem is how much resources we use.
Is that view consistent with large mansions in Chevy Chase?
I think that those are, for the most part, a historical fact. And we need to come to a collective, vision of what this looks like. I'm not going to, our organization is headquartered, and we don't live in it, is headquartered out of one of the largest historical mansions in Chevy Chase. In fact, at Wood End Nature Sanctuary. It's no longer a residence, but we're actually still zoned as a residential property. And we're using it to bring, thousands of people nature education. And so there are values in all kinds of property types, but we need to look at inequities in our society. And those mansions have a very discriminatory past, which we've examined closely. The history of redlining and the history of forcing people to live with less while others can live with more is a real one that has led to this unequal access to resource use. So we could say everyone should have access to a mansion, or we could say, how about we create a vision in which everybody has what they need and lives joyfully with less resources than we currently use as a society. I think we can get there. I don't think it means never any mansions in Chevy Chase, but it does mean that we need to really think carefully about the history of why those houses are the way they are and what we can do to share.
Would you upzone Chevy Chase?
We advocate for higher density development near transit. So the transit part is really important. And there may be some opportunities. Chevy Chase already has upzoned itself around the Chevy Chase Lake Transit Stop, for example. That's a great opportunity there. A lot of upzoning is coming in right there, right at that transit stop.
But as you know, Chevy Chase, they fought not to bring the red line through there. So they did that.
They did that. So
to say that I will allow a historical artifact to then drive the future.
So Neil, you're asking a really tough question. Let me come at it from a slightly different angle. Because I want to say that we have many members of Audubon Naturalist Society who live in Chevy Chase, right close to our headquarters.
That's why I'm asking.
Absolutely. You. And they love the nature that they have access to. They obviously love, their community and their homes the way they are. And so do most people, want to, including lower income people. People love what the communities that they have and they know and that they have stability in. So asking people to change needs to include giving them a vision for what that change enables, both for the broader society and for themselves. And it's really important when we ask people to change the landscape where they live, partly because this is a political question and they have political power. It's really important to make sure that they see a vision in it that is a beautiful one for them, as well as for the society around them. So maybe in a place like Chevy Chase, that looks like, shared backyards and community gardens that people have really wonderful, the really wonderful safe places for their kids to play that they continue to enjoy, but there's more units around and it doesn't get it, it's managed to keep the metro out so it doesn't get a high rise, but we still really need to focus on that access to transit. And I think we need, from a political perspective, we need people's buy-in. And that may mean moving a little slower than we want to from a climate change and an equity perspective.
Do you have time to move slower from a climate change perspective?
We need to take the time to not backfire on ourselves. And there are maybe other places where we can move faster. Maybe we can move, for example, the wastewater treatment plants and the stormwater. They did move faster on wastewater treatment plants. That was good. Stormwater is harder. Now we need to really tackle it. So I think we need to, yes, we need to ask people to change certain things about the way they live, I think. But we won't get anywhere politically if we do so mainly with sticks. We need to offer people the opportunity to take part in creating this vision.
Well, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I really appreciate it.
Tell me what you're thinking. Why do you always have to leave me here hanging off a cliff? I'm just so tired of trying to make sense of everything that you say and do.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Eliza Cava? First, stormwater management has evolved dramatically over time. Before 1990, when the state of Maryland passed its stormwater law, Montgomery County was already levying an impervious surface tax on residents to fund stormwater management in the county. Most of that early effort was focused on ponds that would catch runoff. The 1990 law and subsequent changes at the federal, state, and local level shifted the emphasis of the stormwater management law from flooding to pollution, in big part responding to environmental demands to save the Chesapeake Bay. Since then, runoff management has been about water quality and treatment, with focus on extracting nutrients from wastewater, changing agricultural practices regarding fertilizers. With stormwater runoff, too, the monitoring has mainly been about water quality, for example, temperature and other characteristics. But flooding, a problem of water volume, and pollution, a water quality issue, intersect, especially when we get bigger and bigger storms. It is also worth pointing out that the law measured the stormwater problem by how much water is infiltrated into the ground where it falls as rain. The runoff amounts are less relevant from a legal perspective because that depends on the size of the storm over which we don't have control. Eliza Cava's solution of more wetlands is scientifically desirable but politically very difficult. Expanding floodplains and prohibiting building activity in places where it had been allowed before is expected to raise hackles. But we may be fortunate that the Maryland National Parks and Planning Commission owns much of the right-of-way by streams and creeks, and increased floodplain protection and wetlands rejuvenation can start there. Second, while lot-to-lot runoff, from building to building runoff, often dominates the debate over stormwater management, overhauling old concrete structures such as Wheaton Mall and public infrastructure such as roads might bring the biggest bang for the buck. The complication here really is about the lack of coordination between different levels and agencies of government. To take one example, the big roadways in the county are the responsibility of Maryland State Highway Administration and not the county government. Last week, the Maryland State representatives from District 18, which is centered on the Kensington area of Montgomery County, wrote a joint letter to the State Highway Administration pointing out road design flaws that were causing flooding in their district. County Delegation Leader Mark Corman has written a separate letter to the State Highway Administration as well. The coordination problem exists even within the county, where Montgomery County Department of Transportation lifts and puts down road surfaces without adding bioswales, even when potential locations are identified by the Department of Environmental Protection. Who is supposed to coordinate these departments, and who wants to spend the political capital doing it? During my interview, Eliza Cava asked me pointedly about what I would do. There are institutional mechanisms that can be used to enable coordination, but these institutional mechanisms themselves require political will, which, if it were present, would make coordination happen anyway. To understand this matter of political will, I turn again to Eliza Cava's words. She points out that Stormwater Partners, the local advocacy group she is part of, has not taken an official position on redevelopment and stormwater. How could this be? If concrete generates more runoff, then surely a group interested in runoff would have a clear position on the matter. If even a group fully committed to proper stormwater management does not offer a formal position, then can we expect the government to have the political will? You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Sic Em Buster, a Washington area rock and metal band. The excerpts used in this episode are from their song I've Got Athlete's Foot and I'm Wearing Your Socks. You can find them on Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone who might, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.